双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
An Inland Voyage by Robert Louis Stevenson. Preface to the first edition. To equip so small a book with a preface is, I am half afraid, to sin against proportion. But a preface is more than an author can resist, for it is the reward of his labors. When the foundation stone is laid, the architect appears with his plans, and struts for an hour before the public eye. So, with the writer in his preface. He may have never a word to say, but he must show himself for a moment in the portico, hat in hand, and, with an urbane demeanor. It is best, in such circumstances, to represent a delicate shade of manner between humility and superiority, as if the book had been written by someone else, and you had merely run over it and inserted what was good. But for my part, one have not yet learned the trick to that perfection. I am not yet able to dissemble the warmth of my sentiments towards a reader, and, if I meet him on the threshold, it is to invite him in with country cordiality. To say truth, I had no sooner finished reading this little book in proof than I was seized upon by a distressing apprehension. It occurred to me that I might not only be the first to read these pages, but the last as well, that I might have pioneered this very smiling tract of country all in vain, and find not a soul to follow in my steps. The more I thought, the more I disliked the notion, until the distaste grew into a sort of panic terror, and I rushed into this preface, which is no more than an advertisement for readers. What am I to say for my book? Caleb and Joshua brought back from Palestine a formidable bunch of grapes. Alas! My book produces not so nourishing, and for the matter of that, we live in an age when people prefer a definition to any quantity of fruit. I wonder, would a negative be found enticing? For, from the negative point of view, I flatter myself this volume has a certain stamp. Although it runs to considerably upwards of 200 pages, it contains not a single reference to the imbecility of God's universe, nor so much as a single hint that I could have made a better one myself. I really do not know where my head can have been. I seem to have forgotten all that makes it glorious to be man. 'Tis an omission that renders the book philosophically unimportant, but I am in hopes the eccentricity may please in frivolous circles. To the friend who accompanied me I owe many thanks already. Indeed, I wish I owed him nothing else. But at this moment I feel towards him an almost exaggerated tenderness. He, at least, will become my reader, if it were only to follow his own travels alongside of mine. RLS. Antwerp to Boom. We made a great stir in Antwerp docks. A stevedore and a lot of dock porters took up the two canoes, and ran with them for the slip. A crowd of children followed cheering. The cigarette went off in a splash, and a bubble of small breaking water. Next moment the Arethusa was after her. A steamer was coming down. Men on the paddle box shouted hoarse warnings. The stevedore and his porters were bawling from the quay. But in a stroke or two the canoes were away out in the middle of the Scheldt, and all steamers, stevedores, and other longshore vanities were left behind. The sun shone brightly. The tide was making for jolly miles an hour. The wind blew steadily, with occasional squalls. For my part, I had never been in a canoe under sail in my life, and my first experiment out in the middle of this big river was not made without some trepidation. What would happen when the wind first caught my little canvas? I suppose it was almost as trying a venture into the regions of the unknown as to publish a first book, or to marry. But my doubts were not of long duration, and in 5 minutes you will not be surprised to learn that I had tied my sheet. I own I was a little struck by this circumstance myself. Of course, in company with the rest of my fellow-men, I had always tied the sheet in a sailing boat, but in so little and crank a concern as a canoe, and, with these charging squalls, I was not prepared to find myself follow the same principle, and it inspired me with some contemptuous views of our regard for life. It is certainly easier to smoke with the sheet fastened, but I had never before weighed a comfortable pipe of tobacco against an obvious risk, and gravely elected for the comfortable pipe. It is a commonplace, that we cannot answer for ourselves before we have been tried. But it is not so common a reflection, and surely more consoling, that we usually find ourselves a great deal braver and better than we thought. I believe this is everyone's experience, but an apprehension that they may belie themselves in the future prevents mankind from trumpeting this cheerful sentiment abroad. I wish sincerely, for it would have saved me much trouble, there had been someone to put me in a good heart about life when I was younger, to tell me how dangers are most portentous on a distant sight, and how the good in a man's spirit will not suffer itself to be overlaid, and rarely or never deserts him in the hour of need. But we are all for tootling on the sentimental flute in literature, and not a man among us will go to the head of the march to sound the heady drums. It was agreeable upon the river. A barge or two went past laden with hay. Reeds and willows bordered the stream, and cattle and grey venerable horses came and hung their mild heads over the embankment. Here and there was a pleasant village among trees, with a noisy shipping yard. Here and there a villa in a lawn. The wind served us well up the Scheldt, and thereafter up the Rupel, and we were running pretty free when we began to sight the brickyards of Boom, lying for a long way on the right bank of the river. The left bank was still green and pastoral, with alleys of trees along the embankment, and here and there a flight of steps to serve a ferry, where perhaps there sat a woman with her elbows on her knees, or an old gentleman with a staff and silver spectacles. But Boom and its brickyards grew smokier and shabbier with every minute, until a great church with a clock and a wooden bridge over the river indicated the central quarters of the town. Boom is not a nice place, and is only remarkable for one thing, that the majority of the inhabitants have a private opinion that they can speak English, which is not justified by fact. This gave a kind of haziness to our intercourse. As for the Hotel de la Navigation, I think it is the worst feature of the place. It boasts of a sanded parlor, with a bar at one end, looking on the street, and another sanded parlor, darker and colder, with an empty birdcage and a tricolor subscription box by way of sole adornment, where we made shift to dine in the company of 3 uncommunicative engineer apprentices and a silent bagman. The food, as usual in Belgium, was of a nondescript occasional character. Indeed, I have never been able to detect anything in the nature of a meal among this pleasing people. They seem to peck and trifle with viands all day long in an amateur spirit, tentatively French, truly German, and somehow falling between the two. The empty birdcage, swept and garnished, and with no trace of the old piping favorite, save where 2 wires had been pushed apart to hold its lump of sugar, carried with it a sort of graveyard cheer. The engineer apprentices would have nothing to say to us, nor indeed to the bagman, but talked low and sparingly to one another, or raked us in the gaslight with a gleam of spectacles. For though handsome lads, they were all, in the Scots phrase, barnacled. There was an English maid in the hotel, who had been long enough out of England to pick up all sorts of funny foreign idioms, and all sorts of curious foreign ways, which need not here be specified. She spoke to us very fluently in her jargon, asked us information as to the manners of the present day in England, and obligingly corrected us when we attempted to answer. But as we were dealing with a woman, perhaps our information was not so much thrown away as it appeared. The sex likes to pick up knowledge and yet preserve its superiority. It is good policy, and almost necessary in the circumstances. If a man finds a woman admire him, were it only for his acquaintance with geography, he will begin at once to build upon the admiration. It is only by unintermittent snubbing that the pretty ones can keep us in our place. Men, as Miss Howe or Miss Harlowe would have said, are such encroachers. For my part, I am body and soul with the women, and after a married couple, there is nothing so beautiful in the world as the myth of the divine huntress. It is no use for a man to take to the woods. We know him. St. Anthony tried the same thing long ago, and had a pitiful time of it by all accounts. But there is this about some women, which overtops the best gymnosophist among men, that they suffice to themselves, and can walk in a high and cold zone without the countenance of any trousered being. I declare, although the reverse of a professed ascetic, I am more obliged to women for this ideal than I should be to the majority of them, or indeed to any but one. For a spontaneous kiss, there is nothing so encouraging as the spectacle of self-sufficiency. And when I think of the slim and lovely maidens, running the woods all night to the note of Diana's horn, moving among the old oaks, as fancy-free as they, things of the forest and the starlight, not touched by the commotion of man's hot and turbid life, although there are plenty other ideals that I should prefer, I find my heart beat at the thought of this one. 'Tis to fail in life, but to fail with what a grace! That is not lost which is not regretted. And where, here slips out the mail, where would be much of the glory of inspiring love, if there were no contempt to overcome? On the Willbrook Canal. Next morning, when we set forth on the Willbrook Canal, the rain began heavy and chill. The water of the canal stood at about the drinking temperature of tea, and under this cold aspersion, the surface was covered with steam. The exhilaration of departure, and the easy motion of the boats under each stroke of the paddles, supported us through this misfortune while it lasted, and when the cloud passed and the sun came out again, our spirits went up above the range of stay-at-home humors. A good breeze rustled and shivered in the rows of trees that bordered the canal. The leaves flickered in and out of the light in tumultuous masses. It seemed sailing whether to eye and ear. But down between the banks, the wind reached us only in faint and desultory puffs. There was hardly enough to steer by. Progress was intermittent and unsatisfactory. A jocular person, of marine antecedents, hailed us from the towpath with a "C'est vite, mais c'est long." The canal was busy enough. Every now and then we met or overtook a long string of boats, with great green tillers, high sterns with a window on either side of the rudder, and perhaps a jug or a flower pot in one of the windows. A dinghy following behind, a woman busied about the day's dinner, and a handful of children. These barges were all tied one behind the other with tow ropes, to the number of 25 or 30, and the line was headed and kept in motion by a steamer of strange construction. It had neither paddle wheel nor screw, but by some gear not rightly comprehensible to the unmechanical mind, it fetched up over its bow a small bright chain which lay along the bottom of the canal, and, paying it out again over the stern, dragged itself forward, link by link, with its whole retinue of loaded scows, until one had found out the key to the enigma. There is something solemn and uncomfortable in the progress of one of these trains, as it moved gently along the water with nothing to mark its advance but an eddy alongside dying away into the wake. Of all the creatures of commercial enterprise, a canal barge is by far the most delightful to consider. It may spread its sails, and then you see it sailing high above the treetops and the windmill, sailing on the aqueduct, sailing through the green cornlands, the most picturesque of things amphibious. Or the horse plods along at a foot-pace, as if there were no such thing as business in the world. And the man dreaming at the tiller sees the same spire on the horizon all day long. It is a mystery how things ever get to their destination at this rate. And to see the barges waiting their turn at a lock affords a fine lesson of how easily the world may be taken. There should be many contented spirits on board, for such a life is both to travel and to stay at home. The chimney smokes for dinner as you go along. The banks of the canal slowly unroll their scenery to contemplative eyes. The barge floats by great forests and through great cities with their public buildings and their lamps at night. And, for the bargee, in his floating home, traveling abed, it is merely as if he were listening to another man's story, or turning the leaves of a picture book in which he had no concern. He may take his afternoon walk in some foreign country on the banks of the canal, and then come home to dinner at his own fireside. There is not enough exercise in such a life for any high measure of health, but a high measure of health is only necessary for unhealthy people. The slug of a fellow, who is never ill nor well, has a quiet time of it in life. and dies all the easier. I am sure I would rather be a bargee than occupy any position under heaven that required attendance at an office. There are few callings, I should say, where a man gives up less of his liberty in return for regular meals. The bargee is on shipboard. He is master in his own ship. He can land whenever he will. He can never be kept beating off a lee shore a whole frosty night when the sheets are as hard as iron. And so far as I can make out, time stands as nearly still with him as is compatible with the return of bedtime or the dinner hour. It is not easy to see why a bargee should ever die. Halfway between Willbrook and Villavord, in a beautiful reach of canal like a squire's avenue, we went ashore to lunch. There were 2 eggs, a junk of bread, and a bottle of wine on board the Arethusa, and 2 eggs and an Etna cooking apparatus on board the Cigarette. The master of the latter boat smashed one of the eggs in the course of disembarkation, but observing pleasantly that it might still be cooked à la papier, he dropped it into the Etna, in its covering of Flemish newspaper. We landed in a blink of fine weather, but we had not been 2 minutes ashore before the wind freshened into half a gale, and the rain began to patter on our shoulders. We sat as close about the Etna as we could. The spirits burned with great ostentation. The grass caught flame every minute or two, and had to be trodden out, and before long, there were several burnt fingers of the party. But the solid quantity of cookery accomplished was out of proportion with so much display, and when we desisted, after 2 applications of the fire, the sound egg was little more than lukewarm, and as for à la papier, it was a cold and sordid fricassee of printer's ink and broken eggshell. We made shift to roast the other 2 by putting them close to the burning spirits, and that with better success. And then we uncorked the bottle of wine, and sat down in a ditch with our canoe aprons over our knees. It rained smartly. Discomfort, when it is honestly uncomfortable and makes no nauseous pretensions to the contrary, is a vastly humorous business, and people well steeped and stupefied in the open air are in a good vein for laughter. From this point of view, even egg à la papier offered by way of food may pass muster as a sort of accessory to the fun. But this manner of jest, although it may be taken in good part, does not invite repetition, and from that time forward, the Etna voyaged like a gentleman in the locker of the Cigarette. It is almost unnecessary to mention that when lunch was over and we got aboard again and made sail, the wind promptly died away. The rest of the journey to Villavord, we still spread our canvas to the unfavoring air, and with now and then a puff, and now and then a spell of paddling, drifted along from lock to lock, between the orderly trees. It was a fine, green, fat landscape, or rather a mere green-water lane, going on from village to village. Things had a settled look, as in places long lived in. Crop-headed children spat upon us from the bridges as we went below, with a true conservative feeling. But even more conservative were the fishermen, intent upon their floats, who let us go by without one glance. They perched upon sterlings and buttresses, and along the slope of the embankment, gently occupied. They were indifferent, like pieces of dead nature. They did not move any more than if they had been fishing in an old Dutch print. The leaves fluttered, the water lapped, but they continued in one stay like so many churches established by law. You might have trepanned every one of their innocent heads, and found no more than so much coiled fishing line below their skulls. I do not care for your stalwart fellows in india-rubber stockings breasting up mountain torrents with a salmon rod, but I do dearly love the class of man who plies his unfruitful art, for ever and a day, by still and depopulated waters. At the last lock, just beyond Villavord, there was a lock mistress who spoke French comprehensibly, and told us we were still a couple of leagues from Brussels. At the same place, the rain began again. It fell in straight, parallel lines, and the surface of the canal was thrown up into an infinity of little crystal fountains. There were no beds to be had in the neighborhood. Nothing for it but to lay the sails aside and address ourselves to steady paddling in the rain. Beautiful country houses, with clocks and long lines of shuttered windows, and fine old trees standing in groves and avenues, gave a rich and somber aspect in the rain and the deepening dusk to the shores of the canal. I seem to have seen something of the same effect in engravings. Opulent landscapes, deserted and overhung with the passage of storm. And throughout we had the escort of a hooded cart, which trotted shabbily along the towpath, and kept at an almost uniform distance in our wake. The Royal Sport Nautique. The rain took off near Laeken, but the sun was already down. The air was chill, and we had scarcely a dry stitch between the pair of us.
Nay.
Now we found ourselves near the end of the Olive Verte, and on the very threshold of Brussels. We were confronted by a serious difficulty. The shores were closely lined by canal boats, waiting their turn at the lock. Nowhere was there any convenient landing place. Nowhere so much as a stable yard to leave the canoes in for the night. We scrambled ashore and entered an estaminet where some sorry fellows were drinking with the landlord. The landlord was pretty round with us. He knew of no coach house or stable yard, nothing of the sort, and seeing we had come with no mind to drink, he did not conceal his impatience to be rid of us. One of the sorry fellows came to the rescue. Somewhere in the corner of the basin there was a slip, he informed us, and something else besides, not very clearly defined by him, but hopefully construed by his hearers. Sure enough, there was the slip in the corner of the basin, and at the top of it 2 nice-looking lads in boating clothes. The Arethusa addressed himself to these. One of them said there would be no difficulty about a night's lodging for our boats, and the other, taking a cigarette from his lips, inquired if they were made by Searle and Son. The name was quite an introduction. Half a dozen other young men came out of a boathouse bearing the superscription Royal Sport Nautique, and joined in the talk. They were all very polite, voluble, and enthusiastic, and their discourse was interlarded with English boating terms, and the names of English boat builders and English clubs. I do not know, to my shame, any spot in my native land where I should have been so warmly received by the same number of people. We were English boating men, and the Belgian boating men fell upon our necks. I wonder if French Huguenots were as cordially greeted by English Protestants when they came across the Channel out of great tribulation. But after all, what religion knits people so closely as a common sport? The canoes were carried into the boathouse. They were washed down for us by the club servants. The sails were hung out to dry,
And
everything made as snug and tidy as a picture. And in the meanwhile we were led upstairs by our newfound brethren, for so more than one of them stated the relationship, and made free of their lavatory. This one lent us soap, that one a towel, a third and fourth helped us to undo our bags. And all the time such questions, such assurances of respect and sympathy. I declare I never knew what glory was before. Yes, yes, the Royal Sport Nautique is the oldest club in Belgium. We number 200. This is not a substantive speech, but an abstract of many speeches. The impression left upon my mind after a great deal of talk, and very youthful, pleasant, natural, and patriotic it seems to me to be, we have gained all races, except those where we were cheated by the French. You must leave all your wet things to be dried.
oh,
Entre frères. In any boathouse in England, we should find the same. I cordially hope they might.
en terre,
Vous employez de sliding seats.
n'est-ce pas?
We are all employed in commerce during the day, but in the evening,
Vrai. Nous sommes sérieux.
these were the words. They were all employed over the frivolous mercantile concerns of Belgium during the day, but in the evening they found some hours for the serious concerns of life. I may have a wrong idea of wisdom, but I think that was a very wise remark. People connected with literature and philosophy are busy all their days in getting rid of second-hand notions and false standards. It is their profession, in the sweat of their brows, by dogged thinking, to recover their old fresh view of life, and distinguish what they really and originally like, from what they have only learned to tolerate perforce. And these royal nautical sportsmen had the distinction still quite legible in their hearts. They had still those clean perceptions of what is nice and nasty, what is interesting and what is dull, which envious old gentlemen referred to as illusions. The nightmare illusion of middle age. The bear's hug of custom gradually squeezing the life out of a man's soul had not yet begun for these happy-starred young Belgians. They still knew that the interest they took in their business was a trifling affair compared to their spontaneous, long-suffering affection for nautical sports. To know what you prefer,